Socialization, infancy to old age. Social experience, the key to our humanity. Without social experience, a child's incapable of thought, emotion, meaningful action. They're more of an object than a person. So what is socialization? This is the lifelong social experience by which we learn our culture and our potential as human beings. That social experience is also the basis for our personality. Personality is a person's fairly consistent patterns of acting, thinking, and feeling. We build our personality by taking in and internalizing our surroundings. Nature and nurture. Now, many mistakenly took Darwin's work to mean that human behavior was instinctive, and therefore some people are born criminals, women are innately emotional, men are innately rational. But people trying to understand cultural diversity also made mistakes. And while it's easy to conclude that less technologically sophisticated societies were biologically less evolved and therefore less human, this is a very damaging idea. And this is the view that really helped justify colonialism. If certain groups of people are less human, then why not exploit them? And so Watson develops the theory called behaviorism. And this states that behavior is not instinctive, but learned. Human behavior is rooted in nurture, not nature. What does that mean? It means while we do inherit some potential, the development of our genes, of that potential we might inherit, depends on how we're nurtured. So basically, it's not nature versus nurture. It's nurture is our nature. We do know that socially cutting people off from the world can be very harmful, and there's been quite a bit of research on this. Researchers can't put people in isolation for long periods of time, so they did some studies with monkeys. So the Harlows took rhesus monkeys and placed them in varying degrees of social isolation. And it turned out that once you've had about 6 months of social isolation, that's a mouthful, that seriously disturbs development. So what they did is these monkeys were placed in cages with this wire mesh pretend mother who couldn't interact, obviously. When the artificial monkey was covered with soft terry cloth, the monkeys clung to it, and they benefited from that closeness. And this experiment confirmed how important it is for adults to cradle infants affectionately. Now, up to 3 months of isolation, the monkeys could recover, but by about 6 months, that isolation causes irreversible emotional and behavioral damage. So how are we socialized? We're going to talk about 6 researchers who've made pretty big contributions to this field. Freud, Piaget, Kohlberg, Gilligan, Herbert Mead, and Erikson. So let's start with Freud. Freud says humans have 2 basic needs. This life instinct, which is our need for bonding, and a death instinct, which is an aggressive drive. And that these forces operate at an unconscious level, and that causes deep inner tension. Incorporating these basic needs along with the influence of society, Freud develops his model of personality. You guys are probably all familiar with this. It's id, ego, and superego. So our id is basically the I want part of us. It's our basic drives. They're unconscious. They want immediate satisfaction, and they're present at birth. But society really wants us to keep that in check. Okay? So the flip side of the id is the superego. This is our conscience. Begins to form as we become aware of parental demands and that behavior should take into account society's norms. So that's like the part of you that's telling you what behavior is appropriate and what you should or shouldn't do. And your ego is responsible for navigating between the two. That's your conscious effort to balance that innate pleasure-seeking id with the demands of society. We can't have everything we want. Sure, we could eat chocolate cake for breakfast every day, but there'd be consequences for that. So initially, kids only feel good in a physical way, but by age 3 or 4, they can feel good or bad as they start to judge their behavior against norms. Now, the in the ego or superego are in conflict, and the ego of a well-adjusted person keeps that in balance. And Freud argues that when we have conflicts in our childhood that we don't resolve, that can result in a personality disorder later on. Now, culture, which is part of our superego and helps develop our superego, represses those selfish demands. Okay, and the competing hot mess today. The competing demands of self and society often result in compromise. Okay, and the process by which those selfish drives turn into socially accepted behavior is called sublimation. Now, some problems with Freud. Number 1, loved cocaine. Number 2, kind of a misogynist. Okay, so Freud's work presents humans in very male terms and devalues women. These theories are difficult to test scientifically. How would we measure or observe your id, your ego, your superego? How would we observe subconscious desires? But Freud is still important to understand because he influences everyone else who later studies personality. Now, Jean Piaget talks about cognitive development, and he studies human cognition, which is how people think and understand. And he says there's 4 stages of cognitive development. The first is up until about age 2, and it's the sensory motor stage. Basically, we experience the world through our senses, right? So to little kids, everything they know is about sensing. What do they touch? What do they taste? What do they see? What do they smell? What do they feel? What do they hear? Around age 2, we start using language and other symbols, but we can't understand abstract concepts. We can't judge weight. You ever see a little kid try to pick up something, and they just have no idea that it's way too heavy for them? They can't judge size or volume. But by age 7, you can start to think abstractly. So from 7 to 11 is about this concrete operational phase. We start to see causal connections in our surroundings, and kids can start to understand how and why things happen. Now, the final stage, which not everyone reaches, is formal operational. And you can start to reach this around age 12. This is where we can think about things abstractly and critically. And we can reason abstractly. We can comprehend metaphors. We move beyond the idea that stealing is always wrong, but that might be an abstract concept. And there's times where maybe stealing would be okay. Now, Piaget differs from Freud. Piaget sees the mind as active and creative, but maybe as many as a third of us don't even reach this final stage. Yikes. Now, Kohlberg also talks about development, but he talks about moral development. How do we learn how to judge situations as right or wrong? And at that pre-conventional level, rightness is what feels good to me. Okay. At the conventional level, these are our teen years, we start to know right and wrong, and we start to see this in terms of what makes our parents happy and conforms to cultural norms. Now, post-conventional, and again, maybe not everybody reaches this stage, this is where we can think beyond society's norms and consider abstract ethical principles. Things like liberty, justice, freedom. What do those things mean? Just because the law says something is illegal doesn't mean it's just to punish somebody for that. What is lawful may not be right. So like Piaget, he views moral development as having distinct stages. But again, research is limited to boys. Now, Carol Gilligan talks about the social self, and she talks about how boys and girls might have different moral development. That boys tend to have a justice perspective. They tend to rely on formal rules to judge things as right or wrong. And girls have more of a care and responsibility perspective. They judge situations with an eye towards personal relationships and loyalties. Now, is this differences that are inherent in us, or is this part of culture as well? When we look at this, culture really accounts for this, how we've been socialized. George Herbert Mead talks about the social self, and he is the author, creator, theorist who comes up with social behaviorism. And this is explaining how social experiences develop our personality. And he talks about the self, the part of our personality that's composed of self-awareness and self-image. And he says this develops only with experience, social experience. It's not there at birth. Social experience is that exchange of symbols. It's everything from waving hands, smiling at people. And to understand intention, we have to be able to take another person's point of view, right? So sometimes we misunderstand what people are trying to tell us, especially with so much of our communication being electronic, right? If we're getting text messages, I think you've all been in the position of something you said came across wrong and you misinterpreted something someone said. The most generous thing we can do is to maybe think about the person sending us the message and think about, oh, would they ever mean this less gracious interpretation that we've taken? And Mead calls that taking the role of the other. So all social interaction involves us seeing ourselves as others see us, that taking the role of the other. And Mead also talks about the looking glass self. This is our self-image based on how we think others see us. Okay, so there's how we see ourselves, how we think other people see us, and then there's also how other people actually see us. And he says the self has two parts. The active side of the self is I, and the objective side of the self is me. Yeah, we're getting kind of philosophical here, right? He says that we go through stages of development as well, and the key to developing the self is taking the role of others. So babies can't do this, okay? Babies imitate, right? Babies reach a certain stage, and like you smile at them, they smile. You laugh, they laugh, right? But as kids get a little older and they learn language and other symbols, they start to play, right? And their self starts to develop through how they play. And then the game stage is where we gradually can take the role of several others at once, right? So by around age 7, we're capable of engaging in team sports. Think about like when you're playing a game and you're being strategic, part of what you have to do to be successful is to think about what the other people you're playing against are going to do next. There is a final stage in the development of self, and Mead uses the term generalized other to refer to this widespread cultural norms and value we use when we evaluate ourselves. Now, some people criticize this because it doesn't really allow for biology. Erickson says there's 8 stages of moral development. There's infancy, and up till about 18 months old, we're learning to trust or mistrust people. Is my world safe? When I cry for my mom, does she hum? When I cry because I'm hungry, does she feed me? When I poop in my pants, does she change my diaper? Toddlerhood, up to about age 3, we're learning to cope with the world in a confident way. If we do not learn self-control, though, that can lead to us doubting our abilities. Preschool, this is like initiative versus guilt. We're learning to engage with our surroundings, including people outside the family. Failure to meet your parents' expectations can result in feeling guilty. Up until adolescence starts, the focus here is industriousness versus inferiority. We take a lot of pride in our accomplishments. We fear not measuring up. In adolescence, we're looking at gaining our own identity, and this is really hard phase to go through. In young adulthood, it's intimacy versus isolation. Can we form and keep intimate relationships? Can we balance the need to bond with the need for our own identity? In middle adulthood, you're looking at making a difference versus are you self-absorbed? And in old age, integrity versus despair. Looking back at our accomplishments with a sense of integrity and satisfaction. Now, some criticism of this is not everyone confronts these challenges in this order. And failure to meet a challenge at one point in life doesn't necessarily mean we're doomed to fail later on. So who and what socializes us? Family, school, peers, the media? A little bit of everything. Family has the biggest impact on us. Family teaches us skills, values, beliefs, so much stuff we get from our families. Nothing is more likely to produce a happy, well-adjusted kid than a loving family. Now, some things we learn in our family are unintentional, right? We learn from the kind of environment our parents and the adults around us create. They're not always modeling the best behavior for us either. family gives us social position too, right? In terms of our race, our religion, our ethnicity, our social class. And these all become part of our self-concept. And social class in turn affects what parents expect of their children. So lower class people tend to favor obedience and conformity, and well-to-do people tend to favor good judgment and creativity. All parents, to some degree, act in ways that encourage their children to follow in their footsteps. Now, school opens up the world to us. This is the first place generally where we're meeting friends, people with different backgrounds. We start to see the importance that society attaches to race and gender. Kids tend to play in like same-sex groups or associate with kids of a similar race and ethnicity. We're also learning knowledge and skills. And there's also a hidden curriculum. So think about things like a spelling bee, right? Or playing sports. These teach us the value of competition and how to showcase success. School's our first experience with bureaucracy. And it's a place where we also get socialized into gender roles. Now, our peers also impact us, especially during our teen years. This is our social group whose members have interests, social position, and age in common. We form relationships. They influence how we speak, how we dress, how we spend our time. Teens are able to discuss, and children, right, interests that you have that adults don't have, right? So I have a nephew who sometimes really likes to talk about video games, and he reads a ton, as do I, but he reads very different genres than I do, and sometimes he'll just get into a real deep dive on something with me and I have no idea what he's talking about. And while I'm always interested in him and excited about what he's excited about, right, sometimes as an adult you're just like, ugh, you're not into whatever the kids are talking about. We're also influenced by peer groups that we don't belong to, but we would like to join. And you guys are in college, and this is going to be particularly true of you at this point. As you're thinking about what kind of career you want to have, do you want to go to grad school? Do you want to get an internship? You're going to be influenced by groups you hope to participate in, and that's called anticipatory socialization. Now, the mass media also has a big impact on us, and you guys have grown up to some degree with social media. This did not obviously exist when I was a kid, right? And so mass media is a means for transmitting information from a single source to a vast audience. TV, newspapers, books, stuff like that. Social media is media that allows people to communicate with one another, share information, form communities, and is interactive. So thinking about time spent engaged with the media, it's sort of interesting that your book is still calling this watching TV, right? Because I think that people of certain generations watch TV, but I don't think your generation really watches TV, or what you consider watching TV is probably more streaming. It's probably not watching things as they air on TV. But the amount of time we spent consuming media increased during the pandemic, which is sort of like a duh statement. Of course, we were all home. What else were we going to do, right? We all watched a lot of Netflix. We might have all watched all of Netflix. But the importance of mass media, and especially social media, is really rising in young kids' lives. So even though most social media websites require you to be 13 to join, it's not that hard to join before you're 13, right? You just change your date of birth. The more children watch television, the slower their cognitive development, the more passive they become, the less likely they use their imagination, and the higher their risk of obesity. Some of these to me seem a little questionable. As television goes, some people are concerned about, some people who are more liberal are concerned about how does TV reproduce stereotypes about race or gender. Is there enough representation? I think with streaming, we're seeing more representation because there's an audience for smaller things that in the past just there wouldn't have been a big enough audience for that on broadcast TV. And some conservatives are concerned that politically correct media has advanced liberal causes. As far as violence in television goes, people get pretty concerned about this, how much violence is in movies, TV. this goes to video games and other things too. Unfortunately, this chapter isn't getting into this a lot, but we do have an entire chapter on media. We could talk about this in a little bit more depth there. But characters often engage in violence and there's no consequences on TV, right? And we also see those characters then in like another movie, or they're fine in the next episode. And so what kind of messages is that sending? And about 2/3 of parents are very concerned that their children are exposed to too much media violence. And there may be other places that socialize us as well. If you're particularly religious and you're a member of a church and you spend a lot of time there, that might be a place that socializes you. Okay, so let's think about our development. Think about your childhood. What was it like? How did you spend your time? It's August while I'm recording this. You'll probably be listening to this and it'll be fall. But thinking about summer, right? How did you spend summer vacation? Were you outside playing with your friends, riding your bikes, hoping the ice cream man would come, running through the sprinklers, playing in someone's pool, right? How did you spend your time? So we think of childhood here in the U.S. as like kind of up till our teens, right? It's generally a carefree time, learning and play. You think you have big problems, but your big problems are things like your mom is going to make you take a bath, or the ice cream man came and your mom didn't get outside with money and time for you to get ice cream, right? Like I wish today my problems were the problems of like, I have to take a bath, right? But childhood is, relatively speaking, a new concept. And for, many, many years, probably until the late 1800s or 1800s somewhere, kids as young as 4 and 5, like they were treated like adults. You lived in the same room as everyone else in your family. Sex happened near or in front of you. You were punished the same way. Early jails included men, women, and children not separated from each other. So this idea of childhood is really grounded in culture. We're fortunate in our country that we don't have to work as children, right? And that we do have that carefree time. Like what's so great about summer vacation when you're a child is that it is carefree, right? We're not going to school. Maybe we got some responsibilities around the house, some chores and stuff, but like we really get to play and have a good time. Maybe you're going to summer camp. You get to hang out with your friends. And here you can kind of see how child labor plays out across the globe, right? So, in these countries that are red with circles on them, 20% or more of the child's population is working between the ages of 5 and 17. Now, 5 and 17 is sort of a broad range, at least from our perspective as Americans, because I would say many Americans get jobs around 14, but the idea that at 5 you're working somewhere, right? We don't really do that here in the U.S. So you can see we got an example here. 9-year-old Claire lives in Montana, and she doesn't work for income, and neither do her friends, right? But in Somalia, 10-year-old Hashi works 30 hours per week herding cattle. He's basically got a full-time job. Then we hit adolescence, okay? And as children start surviving childhood, adolescence develops as this buffer time between childhood and adulthood. It's usually a time of emotional and social turmoil. Young people are developing their own identities. You're going through puberty. Oof, it's a lot. It's also really reflected and rooted in the fact that this isn't time of inconsistency in our lives, right? So like we're not a child and we have more freedom than children have, and maybe we have a job, right? But we might not get to spend our money the way we want to spend our money, and we're not really an adult. We don't have a lot of freedom. So we have a license and maybe we have a car, but it doesn't mean we can just do whatever we want. Adulthood. We can break this down to early adulthood, middle age, and then, being a little older. So early adulthood is up until about age 40. A lot of conflicting priorities. Maybe you're establishing a family, having children. Middle adulthood is roughly the ages of 40 to 65. You start being concerned about your health, career, and family. and then mid-60s and older. So we are at a point, the boomer generation, they're called baby boomers because people came back from the war, they missed each other, they got romantic, and they had a lot of babies. Okay, and so that's a large population. So right now we have a very large elderly, older population. My parents are boomers. They were born in the early 50s. And they outnumber teenagers now. We're actually sort of in a dip right now where our teenage and college age population is pretty small. Quote unquote old age begins about our mid 60s. Don't tell my parents that. People are living longer. The elderly population is growing super fast. As that group is retiring, that means we're going to have more people who aren't working, and we're going to need more health resources. As you get older, stuff happens to you biologically. Your bones become brittle. Your senses are less keen. Your health overall, culturally, health is getting better for older folks, but you'll find you even become like, my mom has been a fall risk for a while. I went to the doctor maybe 5 years ago for a pain in my elbow, and they said, oh, these are just things that happen once you're over 40. Now, in terms of culture goes, in low-income cultures, old age often means wisdom and great influence and respect. Pre-industrial societies are usually gerontocracies, right? So the elderly have the most wealth and power, but industrialism has really weakened the standing. And so we don't have as much respect for our elders. I think there's a big fear of aging in our culture. Along with getting old comes the concept of death and dying. So today, 87% of all people in the U.S. die after age 54. When I updated this statistic, I wanted to cry a little because I am 51, and that just felt like, whoa, that's too young to put there. But early on, for a long time, right, we didn't have like advanced healthcare, we didn't have technology, right? So generally, people died young because of disease or accidents, right? And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, you guys might be familiar with this. She studied death, and she sees it as an orderly transition of 5 stages. It's probably not really quite as neat as she has it laid out, but stages of like periods of denial, right? Anger, negotiation. This is, when we bargain with God. If you just do this, I'll do this. Resignation and acceptance. So even though each stage represents a biological process of aging, it's also socially constructed, right? So when I look back and think about pictures of like my grandmother, or think about how my grandmother looked at a certain age, I feel like my grandmother looked the same through most of my life. But in my grandmother's generation, and she's not, my parents are boomers, so my grandparents are part of the quote unquote greatest generation. And like people looked older when they were much younger. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the TV show The Golden Girls, but this was on TV when I was young, and I thought like they were old and retired, right? You look at their hair, they got like old lady hair, right? But they were like 45. They're younger than I am now, right? I look at my mom, and my mom at 70 versus what my nana looks like at 70 is very different, right? So a lot of this is social constructions as well. In other societies, people might approach these very differently. Class, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, all of these things shape our lives. And each stage involves learning something new, unlearning familiar routines, usually changing and growing as a person. And what we experience really varies based on when we were born, where we were born, right? So a lot of times based on our cohort. Cohort is a group of people that have a common characteristic, but it's usually age, right? So if you again think about like generations, there's things, these generations get kind of grouped together because they go through similar experiences. Some of these people need to be re-socialized, okay? And when that happens, they go to total institutions. These are places where you're isolated from the rest of society and manipulated by staff. The best example of this is prison, Okay. Prison, long-term hospitalization in a mental health facility. The military is probably not a total institution, right, but a very different way of life. In a total institution, the staff supervises all aspects of life. Things are highly standardized. Rules and schedules dictate when, where, and how you will do things. And the purpose is to resocialize someone, radically change their personality by carefully controlling the environment. Guess what? We do a terrible job of this in prison. We do resocialize people, but we resocialize them and we prisonize them. So we don't necessarily rehabilitate them. So it's usually a two-part process. We break down someone's old identity, usually by degrading and humiliating them, and then build a new self through rewards and punishments. Now, sometimes if you've been institutionalized for too long, you don't know how to survive in the outside world. So I don't know if you guys have seen Shawshank Redemption. Probably not. All-time favorite movie. It's the kind of movie where if I come across it, it started on good old-fashioned TV, I will watch it. It does not disappoint. High recommend. Go find it. Go watch it. Okay, there's a man there who's incarcerated, and his name is Brooks, and he's an older man. And when he's in the prison, he runs a library. He's respected while he's there. And he gets paroled. He's probably like in his 70s when he gets paroled. And he gets to the outside world, and now there's cars everywhere, right? And he does not know how to survive. He gets a job, he's bagging groceries, and every time he has to go to the bathroom, like, he asks permission. And his boss is like, yo, you don't got to ask permission every time. And basically, Brooks can't handle it. And he does something very sad.